At 2:13 in the morning, I opened an email demanding $15,000 to keep a fabricated intimate photo of me, built from vacation pictures only my best friend could access, from reaching my employer, my church, and everyone in my contacts. My name is Priscilla Nakamura, and before this happened, I believed I understood the people I trusted and the life I had built. The email arrived on a Thursday at 2:13 in the morning, which I know because I was staring at my phone in the dark, unable to sleep, when the notification lit up the room with that cold white flash that always seems too bright in the middle of the night. The sender's address meant nothing to me. The subject line was blank. There was no greeting, no signature, no attempt at charm or disguise. Just one attached image and a message so blunt it felt almost clinical. The image was me, or something built to look like me, pasted onto a body that was not mine, in a pose I had never taken and in clothing I had never worn. It was the kind of fake that looked real enough to destroy a life if the person who saw it wanted to believe it. Beneath it, the sender demanded $15,000 within 7 days. If I did not pay, they would send the image and 3 others like it to my employer, my church, and every contact in my phone. They had even listed the people and organizations by name. My employer was a regional healthcare nonprofit in Nashville, which meant my job depended on trust. My church was a small congregation where everybody knew everybody else. My contacts included board members, donors, family, old classmates, coworkers, and enough community people that even a rumor could turn into a fire. Whoever had written that email knew exactly which pressure points to press. They had not just found me, they had studied me. My name is Priscilla Nakamura. I was 36 years old then, and I had spent 12 years building a career in communications by being careful. Careful with words, careful with facts, careful with public image, careful with the way I carried myself because I knew better than most people how quickly a reputation can turn into a weapon when the wrong person decides to use it that way. The first thing I felt was not panic, it was disbelief. The second thing I felt was a strange, icy humiliation, even though I had done nothing wrong. That is something people do not explain enough about threats like this. When someone tries to blackmail you with a lie, the lie can still make you feel dirty. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped the phone onto the bed twice before I managed to read the message a second time. I sat there until dawn, going over every possibility I could think of. Maybe it was a random scam. Maybe the photo was fake enough that nobody would believe it. Maybe they had just used one of my social media photos and pasted my face onto some stranger's body. Maybe this was the modern version of a cheap extortion attempt, all noise and no teeth. But the email said my employer, my church, and my entire contact list already existed in the sender's hands. That was the detail that changed everything. They were not bluffing about having access to my personal life. Nobody guessed a church membership list by accident. Nobody assembled donor contacts, work colleagues, and extended family without some kind of real intrusion into my world. By sunrise, I had made myself a cup of coffee. I did not drink and was sitting at my kitchen table staring at the email as if the answer might rise off the screen if I looked hard enough. I did not pay. I also did not call the police right away, not because I wanted to hide it forever, but because I could not yet understand what I was dealing with. I knew enough to understand that once a thing is handed over to law enforcement, it becomes a process. A necessary one, but still a process. And I was not ready to give up control until I understood what part of my life had been breached and by whom. So I did what I always did when something felt unstable. I started gathering facts. The first person I called was Cornelius Ekebi, a digital forensics investigator I had found through a colleague who handled corporate security incidents. Cornelius had the kind of calm voice that made you feel less foolish for being afraid. He told me to preserve everything and forward the original email headers, the attachment, and the message text without altering anything. He also told me not to reply, not to click anything else, and not to let the sender know I had seen it. He came to my apartment later that day with a laptop, a portable drive, and a small notebook full of tidy handwriting. He looked like a man who never wasted motion. He listened to me explain what had happened, then asked me to walk through every possible source of the photos in the attachment. I could not. The image showed my face. That was all I knew for sure. It had been stretched and placed into an intimate-looking scene I had never been in. The body had been digitally altered, but the face was unmistakably mine. Cornelius explained, in the measured way he had, that modern fabricated images often begin with ordinary photos. A single face can be taken from harmless pictures and manipulated into something that never happened. That was when I remembered the vacation album. 18 months earlier, my closest friend, Delphine Achterberg, and I had taken a week-long trip to Charleston. We spent too much money on oysters and too little time sleeping. We took pictures of the beach at sunset, our hotel balcony, old streets, coffee cups, lopsided restaurant selfies, and a handful of family photos because Delphine wanted to capture a few things for her mother. At the end of the trip, I had uploaded the best pictures to a private shared album so we could both keep copies. Only Delphine had access to it. At the time, I had not thought twice about that. Delphine and I had been friends for 20 years. We had met in graduate school when we were both younger, both broke, and both convinced we were one bad decision away from disaster. She was the one person I had never needed to perform for. She knew the version of me who cried over parking tickets, who reordered dinner after a bad day, who sat through funerals with a straight back because grief made me feel clumsy. There are a handful of friendships in a person's life that become part of the structure holding them up. Delphine was one of mine. So when Cornelius asked whether anyone else had ever had access to the album, I said no immediately, then stopped, because there was one other person who might. Delphine's husband. Thaddeus Okonkwo was the sort of man people usually described as polished, because they could not think of a more precise word. He was well-dressed without being flashy, soft-spoken without seeming timid, the kind of man who remembered names and poured wine for the table, and appeared, at least from the outside, to be every bit the steady counterpart to Delphine's bright, more animated personality. I had always thought he was a little reserved with me, but I assumed that was just personality. Some people are warm in groups and less comfortable one-on-one. Still, if he had ever borrowed Delphine's phone or used her laptop, if he had ever known her passwords, if he had ever had access to her cloud accounts, then the picture changed. Cornelius did not jump to conclusions. He asked for the album link, the platform name, and whatever access logs the service could provide. He told me the photos themselves might hold metadata, but the bigger question was who had seen them, when, and from what device. I left him with copies of everything, and spent the rest of the day doing the kind of half-functional work people do when their minds are trapped somewhere else. I answered emails. I sat in on a Zoom call and said the right words at the right times. I sent a text to Delphine about brunch the following weekend, and then stared at the thread for so long, I forgot whether I had already sent it. She replied with a heart emoji and a joke about me always being unavailable before noon. That should have comforted me. Instead, it made the feeling in my stomach worse. 2 days later, Cornelius called. He told me the source photos matched the shared album exactly. Not one or two, but several of the ordinary vacation shots. Not the intimate image itself, which had been fabricated later, but the face source material. He had traced the metadata and confirmed that the images had been downloaded from the album in a way that fit the creation of the fake composites. That meant one thing. Whoever had built the image had access to Delphine's album. I remember sitting very still on my couch while Cornelius explained that possibility. There is a particular kind of silence that arrives when your mind recognizes a threat before your emotions do. It feels as if the room itself has tightened. I thanked him, hung up, and then stared at the wall for a long time before I could move. For several minutes I refused to entertain the most obvious conclusion. It could have been Delphine, I thought. Or it could have been someone who had taken her account, or logged in while she was asleep, or borrowed a device, or guessed a password. But I knew, even as I told myself those things, that one of the central truths of the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. The fake image did not originate from a random stranger scraping my public social media. It came from a private place I had only shared with someone I loved. I did not confront Delphine, not yet. That choice hurt more than I expected because it forced me to admit something I did not want to say out loud. I could not trust my own instincts about the people around me anymore, not until I knew exactly what had happened. If I accused her without evidence and I was wrong, I would destroy a friendship on suspicion. If I said nothing and she was somehow involved, I would be giving someone time to disappear or cover their tracks. So I made a second call, this time to Marisol Vance, a private investigator recommended by an attorney friend. Marisol was methodical in a way that made Cornelius seem warm and loose by comparison. She listened to the facts, asked for the timeline, and said she could work discreetly alongside Cornelius to determine who had accessed the album and what devices were involved. She also told me something that sounded almost routine coming from her, but did not feel routine at all to me. If the email had been sent using an anonymizing service, there would be layers, but layers still leave traces. We spent the next 2 weeks in a strange limbo. I kept going to work. I kept smiling in meetings. I kept answering questions from donors and staff about communication campaigns and community outreach and public health messaging, while feeling as though my own life was being quietly examined through a microscope. At night, I replayed every recent interaction with Delphine and Thaddeus. Had Thaddeus ever looked at me too carefully? Had he ever asked about my work? My church? My family? Had he ever lingered near my phone when I set it down? Had I ever once seen him near Delphine's tablet when the album was open? The trouble with suspicion is that once it enters your head, it begins retroactively rearranging the past. Innocent gestures start to look meaningful. Ordinary politeness begins to feel staged. A comment made months earlier suddenly sounds loaded. I hated myself a little for how quickly my mind turned from trust to surveillance, but I did not know how else to cope with waiting. Marisol found the first real break. The shared album had been accessed from a device registered to Thaddeus on 6 separate occasions over the preceding 4 months. Not 1 or 2 accidental opens. 6 deliberate sessions. Each one lasted long enough to download multiple images. Each one happened late at night. I remember reading the report 3 times before the words settled into my body. 6 times. Late at night. While Delphine was asleep. The details mattered because they stripped away the comfort of uncertainty. This was not a husband who had borrowed his wife's tablet in the middle of the day to look up a recipe or check a text. These were access sessions that read like someone working in secrecy, carefully, repeatedly. Marisol did not stop there. Cornelius traced the anonymized email account used for the extortion. The subscription to the anonymizing service had been paid for with a prepaid card. That card, in turn, had been purchased at a gas station near Thaddeus's workplace. Marisol obtained security footage from the parking lot by working through a public records request tied to a separate matter. And there he was, on a lunch break, walking into the gas station with the kind of ordinary, expressionless concentration of a man who believed he was blending in. The footage alone would not have proved anything. But together with the device access logs and the financial trail, it built a path from the threat email to Thaddeus's hands. I stared at the report in my car after work, the engine off, the parking lot lights glowing faintly over the windshield. I was so angry I felt physically cold. Not just at the blackmail, though that was there too. At the intimacy of the violation. At the patience it had taken. At the fact that someone had apparently sat in the same room as me, eaten dinner at the same table, smiled politely, and gone home to weaponize my face against me. The email had demanded $15,000. For a man like Thaddeus, that was not a small amount, but it was not impossible either. That fact made the motive almost more insulting. He had not done this because he was desperate in some grand, tragic sense that invited sympathy. He had done it because he had dug a hole for himself and decided my life was an acceptable ladder out. Cornelius and Marisol dug further. Thaddeus's financial records showed a mess of gambling debt, not a single bad night, a pattern. Over the preceding year, he had apparently lost more than he could hide comfortably, then hidden it anyway. Payments were late. Transfers were irregular. There were signs of pressure from collection sources, and enough evidence to suggest he had been running out of places to turn. That explanation did not make his choices less monstrous, but it did make them legible in the ugliest possible way. He had not chosen a stranger because strangers are easier to exploit. He had chosen me because he knew me. He knew my job depended on credibility. He knew my church life was intertwined with my reputation. He knew I would be afraid of the public humiliation more than the money itself. He knew that a fabricated intimate image does not need to be true to do damage. It only needs to reach the wrong eyes. When Cornelius told me all of this, he was careful not to sound judgmental, but I could hear the weight of it even in his neutral tone. It is one thing to discover a technical breach. It is another to discover intent. I did not sleep much that week. When I did, I dreamed in fragments, my phone ringing in the dark, Delphine turning away from me, Thaddeus sitting at some invisible desk while my face floated in a file on his screen. I also began noticing how many things I had taken for granted: the safety of ordinary photos, the privacy of private albums, the casual way people share passwords with spouses and partners because trust seems easier than caution. I had always thought of privacy as something I controlled by setting a folder to private or restricting an audience list. Now I understood how fragile that really was. Privacy depends not just on the platform, but on every human being who touches the chain. After Cornelius and Marisol's reports came together, I needed legal advice. That led me to Wilhelmina Castellano, an attorney with a reputation for being both relentless and precise. She read the evidence packet in silence, asked a few questions about the timeline, and then explained exactly what I was looking at. This was extortion. This was unauthorized access. This was the creation and attempted distribution of fabricated intimate images. The law, she told me, was catching up slowly, but it was catching up. Tennessee and federal authorities had tools for this kind of abuse now, and the evidence in my case was strong enough that I did not need to pay, bargain, or negotiate. What I needed to do was preserve the proof and involve law enforcement before the deadline in the threat email expired. I asked the question I had been afraid to ask since the beginning. If I reported this, would the images be sent anyway? Wilhelmina looked at me for a moment and said, "Honestly, maybe. But if they were sent, there would be a paper trail, a timeline, and a stronger criminal case. If I paid, I would only confirm that the threat worked." She had seen this before. Not my exact scenario, but the pattern. A person receives a threat. They panic. They pay. The extorter asks for more. Then more. Then more. The transaction creates proof that pressure succeeded. That was the first time the shape of my next decision felt clear. I still did not reply to the email. Instead, Wilhelmina coordinated directly with the Nashville Metro Police Department's Cybercrimes Unit. She brought them everything: the access logs, the device registration, the prepaid card trail, the parking lot footage, the extortion email, the metadata, the reconstruction of how the image had been made. At that point, the case stopped being a private fear and became an active investigation. The detectives moved quickly, helped by the fact that the extortion deadline was still live. A warrant was issued for Thaddeus's devices. When I heard that, I felt a tense, terrible relief, because once law enforcement enters the room, the story can no longer be contained entirely inside your head. Other people have to look at it. Other people have to say the thing you have already been saying to yourself. This happened, and it happened for real. The search of Thaddeus's laptop confirmed what Cornelius and Marisol had already pieced together. The original composite files were there. The software used to create them was there. Drafts of the extortion email were there. Some of the source photographs were there too, saved, labeled, and arranged like raw material in a little private factory of cruelty. Wilhelmina told me the evidence was essentially airtight. I remember sitting in her office with my hands clasped together so tightly my knuckles hurt, listening to her describe the results in the language lawyers use when they are trying not to be dramatic. She was calm, but she was not casual. She understood exactly how serious this was. And for the first time since the email arrived, I felt something approaching vindication. Not comfort, not peace. Just the knowledge that I had not been imagining the threat, and that I had not been foolish to take it seriously. Still, there was one conversation left that frightened me more than the police report. Delphine. I could not keep the truth from her much longer. Whatever Thaddeus had done, it had been done with material from her life, from her devices, from her marriage. She had a right to know before the arrest became public, so I asked her to come to my apartment the evening before the warrant was executed. She arrived with a bottle of wine, cheerful in the worried, intuitive way that close friends become when they sense something is off, but do not yet know what it is. She sat at my kitchen table and asked what was wrong. I remember hearing my own voice sounding flatter than I intended while I began to tell her. I told her about the email. I told her about the fake image. I told her about the vacation album. I told her about the late-night logins. I told her about the device registration and the prepaid card and the parking lot footage. With each detail, I watched her face change in small, almost imperceptible increments. First confusion, then disbelief, then a kind of stunned, sick recognition that told me she was already understanding where the evidence was heading. She did not interrupt. She did not defend him. When I finished, she sat very still for so long I wondered whether she had gone somewhere inward where I could not follow. Then she asked, in a voice so quiet I had to lean in to hear it, whether I could ever forgive her for not knowing what was happening under her own roof. That broke my heart in a different way. I told her there was nothing to forgive. I meant it. Delphine had been deceived too. She had not protected me because she had not known she needed to. That did not make the pain of it vanish, but it changed the shape of the pain. I was not losing a friend to betrayal by her. I was losing the illusion that her marriage had been as safe as I had believed it was. She cried then, silently at first, then harder. Not the loud, dramatic crying people perform when they want to be seen, but the kind that comes from shock and shame and the collapse of an entire internal map. I moved around the table and held her because I could not think of anything else to do. The next morning Thaddeus was arrested. It happened early, before the city had properly woken up. I did not watch. I did not need to. The call came later, and with it the formal list of charges: extortion, unauthorized computer access, and the creation and distribution of non-consensual fabricated intimate images. Tennessee had only recently sharpened its laws around deepfake abuse, and the prosecutors were clearly prepared to make an example of the evidence. That phrase sounds harsher than it felt in the moment. I did not want him used as an example. I wanted the threat removed from my life. I wanted the panic to end. I wanted to stop checking my phone like it was carrying poison. But the legal system does not operate on wanting. It operates on proof. And for once, proof was on my side. The investigation moved into the next phase. Thaddeus's attorney tried to muddy the story at first, suggesting maybe the files were drafts for something else. Maybe the images were not intended for distribution. Maybe the login records could be explained by shared devices or access through the household network. Those arguments did not survive long under forensic review. The device artifacts were too specific. The payment trail was too clean. The logs were too consistent. There are moments in a case like this where the accused is still living in the world you live in, and you are stunned by the fact that he may be doing ordinary things while prosecutors assemble your suffering into exhibits. I hated that part. I hated that somewhere, while I was trying to breathe, he might have been eating breakfast, talking to an attorney, calling someone from jail, or insisting to himself that this was all a misunderstanding. There are people who create devastation and then behave as though they are the victim of bad timing. Delphine filed for divorce within a month. She told me she had made the decision almost immediately after our conversation. She could not stay married to someone who had used her home, her trust, and her friendship to build an extortion scheme. She said the hardest part was not even the financial deceit, though that was bad enough. It was realizing that while she had been sleeping beside him, he had been sitting in the dark harvesting private photographs of the people she loved most. I had no answer for that except to sit with her in it. Our friendship survived, though not unchanged. I think we were both too tired to perform a dramatic break. What happened between us was stranger and in some ways stronger. We had both been wounded by the same man from different directions. I was the target of the extortion. She was the one whose home had contained the breach. Neither of us had caused it. Neither of us could have prevented it by being more vigilant, more loving, or more intuitive. That understanding became important. It kept guilt from growing where responsibility did not belong. In the weeks after the arrest, I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow. Once a crisis ends, the body often has nowhere to put the adrenaline it has been carrying. I found myself exhausted at strange times, suddenly irritable over minor things, then guilty for being irritable because at least I had not been publicly humiliated. I had to keep reminding myself that survival is not a contest. You can be grateful and wrecked at the same time. My supervisor at work noticed before I said anything. I had been coming in, performing well enough, and then disappearing into a fog by afternoon. I was shorter than usual in meetings. I forgot a few small things I would normally have caught instantly. One day she asked if I was all right, not in a prying way but in the way a good manager asks when she already knows the answer is probably no. I told her a generalized version of what had happened, a privacy violation, a criminal threat, an investigation. I did not give the full details because I was not ready to make the most intimate parts of the story part of office conversation. She did not press. She simply adjusted my workload for a while and told me to tell her if I needed anything else. That support mattered more than I expected. At the time, I had worried most about my job. The threat email had been designed to hit exactly that fear. But the facts never reached my employer, at least not in the way the sender intended. The fabricated images were never sent beyond the original extortion email because we moved quickly enough to cut the plan off before it could spread. That remains one of the great mercies of my life. I do not know if my career would have survived if those photos had been circulated to the wrong people, even if they were fake. I work in communications. Trust is the product. Perception matters. A lie that attaches itself to your face can still damage you even when the truth is on your side. That is what makes this kind of abuse so vicious. It exploits the fact that institutions and communities often react before they verify. Several months later, Thaddeus accepted a plea agreement. The device evidence had made trial look unwinnable, and his lawyers knew it. He pleaded guilty to extortion and the fabricated image charge. He was sentenced to 4 years, with the possibility of parole after 2, and a permanent requirement to register under Tennessee's Cyber Exploitation Offender Registry. When I heard the sentence, I felt only a muted sense of closure. I had imagined, in my angriest moments, that justice would feel bigger than it did. Cleaner. More cinematic. But the reality of justice is often administrative. It is hearings, filings, admissions, obligations, and limitations. It is not the emotional equivalent of a storm passing overhead. It is a locked door being officially shut. I took what I could from it. I took the fact that he could no longer pretend it was harmless. I took the fact that he had been named in court records for exactly what he had done. I took the fact that he had not been able to turn my fear into silence. Wilhelmina called me after the plea and told me something I have thought about often since. Deepfake extortion cases were becoming more common, she said, but the law was still catching up to the speed of the technology. Prosecutors were learning, judges were learning, investigators were learning, and victims had almost no good instincts handed to them by society. People tell you to panic, people tell you to pay, people tell you to hope the threat goes away. Very few people tell you to preserve the evidence first, she said. The cases that ended best usually involved the victim refusing to treat the threat as a bargaining situation. That advice stuck with me because it was so simple and because it ran against every anxious reflex a person has when cornered. I had wanted to send money just to make the problem stop existing for a few minutes. I had wanted to do the fast, shame-based thing. Instead, I investigated. That choice did not feel heroic at the time. It felt slow and uncertain, but it saved me. After the case, I deleted the original vacation album. That was harder than I expected. I am not sentimental in the way some people are, but the pictures represented a specific season of life. There were beach sunsets, a badly lit restaurant photo where Delphine was laughing with her head thrown back, and I had caught the edge of the shot, a picture of our shoes on a boardwalk, the two of us with our hair blown into our faces by salt air. They were ordinary, imperfect, happy photographs, and I did not want them associated forever with what had been done to them. Deleting them felt like losing a second layer of the trip. First, the memory had been violated, then the record of it had to go. But I also understood that what I was deleting was not the friendship or the trip. It was the corrupted storage container around it. The memory lived in me, not in the folder. Delphine and I took another trip the following year. Not because we thought we could go back to the way things were. We could not. But because we wanted to prove to ourselves that the future had not been stolen outright. We chose a different city, a different hotel, different restaurants, and a different photo platform with stronger security that only the two of us could access directly. We were almost absurdly careful about it. New passwords, two-factor authentication, locked devices, no shared links, no casual cloud invites. It was a little sad how much caution now threaded through something that had once been effortless. And yet the trip was good. Better than good, actually, because it was deliberate. We laughed more than I expected. We talked openly about the ways we had both changed. Delphine was quieter than she used to be, but not broken. I was more cautious, but also clearer about where my boundaries now lived. We took pictures anyway. Not because we wanted to pretend nothing had happened, but because we refused to let one violation make us stop making memories. There are still moments when I think about that late-night access pattern. 6 sessions. 6 times he logged into something that was not his. 6 times he opened a private album built on trust and extracted ordinary joy from it to convert into leverage. What stays with me most is the almost banal setting of it. I do not picture a grand villain in a storm or some melodramatic mastermind in a hidden room. I picture a man alone in a dark house, likely with the TV off, perhaps after midnight scrolling through my vacation photos while his wife slept down the hall. I picture him saving and sorting them, selecting the ones that would make me feel exposed. I picture him building a threat out of a beach sunset and a shared meal and 2 friends laughing with wind in their hair. That is what makes the cruelty hard to understand. Not the technology, not even the money, the intimacy. He had access to the most ordinary pieces of our lives, and he turned them into something poisonous. I do not pretend I have a complete moral explanation for what drives a person to that point. Shame? Debt? Entitlement? Cowardice? Probably some ugly combination of all of them, but I no longer feel obligated to understand him in order to know what he did was wrong. That used to feel like an important distinction to make. Now it feels necessary. People often ask, when they hear this story, whether I was scared the whole time. The answer is yes, not continuously in the same way, but yes. I was scared when the email arrived. Scared when Cornelius found the album source. Scared when Marisol traced the access logs. Scared when Wilhelmina said the evidence was strong enough to take to the police. Scared when I told Delphine. Scared when Thaddeus was arrested. Scared of the possibility that something I had never consented to might still be sent out into the world after all. But fear was not the whole story. There was also method. There was also loyalty, complicated and battered though it was. There was also the relief of being believed. There was also the strange calm that comes when the truth, however ugly, finally has somewhere to land. I have kept in touch with Delphine, not in the same way as before, because that version of friendship belonged to a world where both of us assumed certain things were safe. We do not call every day. We do not share everything automatically, but she is still in my life, and that matters. We learned, the hard way, that trust does not have to mean innocence. It can also mean choosing to remain present after innocence is gone. I still work at the nonprofit. My employer never learned the full story, and I remain grateful for that because I know how close the whole thing came to a different ending. I am more careful now about where I store photos, who can see them, and how much of my life I attach to a single platform or account. I used to think those habits belonged to people who were paranoid. Now I think they belong to people who have paid attention. I also think about the advice Wilhelmina gave me whenever I hear someone say they would just pay the ransom to make it go away. Maybe it would feel easier for a day, maybe it would feel quieter for a week, but extortion rarely ends with one payment, and shame rarely disappears when you feed it. What happened to me was terrifying, but it also clarified something I had only understood abstractly before. Privacy is not just a setting, and trust is not just a feeling. Both are systems made up of choices, habits, permissions, and limits. When one person decides to break that system, the damage can spread further than you expect. Still, the system held for me in the end. Not perfectly, not without pain, but enough. Enough that my employer never saw the image. Enough that Delphine found out before the lie could define her marriage any further. Enough that the police got the evidence. Enough that Thaddeus could not hide behind technical confusion or temporary panic. Enough that I did not have to pay to survive what he tried to do. I still think, more than anything else, about the line between the two versions of that vacation album. One version was a private record of a happy trip with my best friend. The other became raw material for a man's greed. The difference between them was not in the photographs themselves. It was in the choice someone else made when he looked at them and decided that friendship, privacy, and trust were tools he could steal. I will never fully understand what makes that kind of cruelty feel possible to the person committing it. But I do know this. Sometimes the most important thing you can do when a threat arrives is not to panic into obedience. It is to slow down, preserve the truth, and force the lie to stand in the light long enough to be seen for what it is. That is what I did. And it was enough.